The wild duck is this cute little 24-inch long-keeled sloop that I found plans for on the internet. It was published in a magazine article. Here are some pictures of a real wild duck under sail. It was plans were sold for the full-size version. It was 19 feet long. Several people built their own versions of it. There weren't a lot of them made from what I can tell. From this drawing, from the original set of drawings for a full-size wild duck, I made this simplified version of the drawing in Photoshop so that I could color it. Then I switched to Procreate on my iPad, where I colored the bottom red and the center section white, but it was a sort of an off-white. I made the mast brown, although in reality the mast and the mast boom will be black. So this gray color was actually from a color drop of a photograph that I made of the half-completed model later in the month. Then back into Photoshop to add a little background so it looks like it's actually in water. So I ordered these plans from England. It took forever to get them. So I'm using tracing paper here to copy the frames and the shape of the keel from the plans so that I can transfer it to wood here in a few minutes. Not an exact science. I wish I had laser cut frames and plans, but I don't. So then I took the tracing paper and put it over some plywood and some basswood and cut it out and taped it to it, and in most cases would lift the tape, put some carbon paper underneath, and then copy the lines from the plans, from the tracing paper to the wood, with the goal of eventually getting to the bandsaw. plans did not include the templates for the sides of the hull or the bottom, so I had to make templates out of cereal boxes, then transfer to wood, then trial fit until I finally got something that looked like the sides and the bottom of the hull. As I braced these pieces in, I would spray them with either Windex or water to warp the wood and let it set for several hours, sometimes overnight, and then come back and work on the next piece. So I do one side of the hull, warp it, wait for hours, do the other side of the hull, warp the wood, wait for hours, then do the two halves of the bottom of the hull, warp the wood, wait for hours, then do the other one, spray some more Windex on there. Windex warps the wood better than water does, for reasons I'll never understand. Here I had some bumps in the wood and I had to cut a slot to relieve some pressure and then reshape it and glue it again. Here I'm adding 2 more long pieces of plywood to double up the width of the long keel to make it stronger and heavier. I always mix up 2-part epoxy on these yellow Post-it notes and use a putty knife. They're real handy because I can use them over and over and keep throwing them away and just wipe off the putty knife every time I'm done. Here I am using oversized popsicle sticks to make a template of the angle of the hull and the keel so that I can make a little stand, because now it's about time to take this boat off the building stand, flip it over, and start working on the top half of it. Here I am cutting the boat off the building board. Now that I got it setting up right, I have to cut the top half of all of these frames off. They were only used to space it correctly to get the hull shaped right. There's a half frame here that I have to insert after the fact. It's a half frame because it goes halfway between one frame and another, and had to be done after the boat was flipped over correctly. This long strip on each side is actually part of the cabin and the bulwarks both. It was hard to get it right. Now I'm putting some Bondo fiberglass resin on the bottoms and sides of each frame to give it some strength against the side of the hull. It would be nice to have well-formed fillets here, but it's pretty hard and I'm doing it pretty sloppy. It adds a lot of strength to the bow. Then I flipped it over and did the same thing to the other side of each frame so that the forward edge and the back edge of each frame had epoxy in it. Now that I've reinforced all the frames, I'm literally painting this Bondo fiberglass epoxy across the entire hull to seal it up so that it can't be damaged by water later after it finally gets in the lake. This is two side pieces for the cockpit combing and the sides of the cabin and the foredeck. There is some awkwardness here with the frames and the shape of the cabin top. So I was forever breaking pieces and redoing them and reshaping them, trying to get it so that the shape of the cabin top would have a nice arc and be symmetrical. The plans as they exist don't really give you much of a clue on how to correctly make the cabin top. They seem to want to have it as one permanent piece where your access to the inside of the hull is only through the cabin latch for like a normal sailboat. But I wanted the whole cabin top to be removable so that I could easily get at the battery and the radio receiver and the sail servo. I use Bondo glazing and spotting putty a lot. You'll see that throughout the rest of the build. Now it's time for fiberglass. Most model boat builders don't necessarily fiberglass their boats. It's certainly a lot easier not to, but if you put a nice thick layer of fiberglass on, it becomes incredibly strong and certainly won't leak through the fiberglass. May leak where you make seams and stuff, but I like having my boats fiberglassed. It's important when you put the glass on that you don't let it cure before you trim the excess off. That way when it's green, it trims quite easy. Also, right after I put it on, I roll toilet paper over it to take off the excess resin. And then later when it's all done, put on one thick layer of resin and then sand that down till I get a good finish. After the initial fiberglass layer, then you have to go back and find any bubbles and cut through them and cut them out and put some more fiberglass filler in each of the bad spots. And make sure you have a good bond of the new fiberglass to the old fiberglass, and then cut that off and trim it and sand it and fluff it and buff it. And you might have to do this 2 or 3 times. Now we're adding that last coat of resin over what I would like to think is the finished fiberglass work, and that's so that we get a smooth surface instead of seeing the texture of the cloth. Of course, after this, I'll be in for a lot of sanding again. But if you do this right, you should have a nice, smooth, glossy finish. This little block of wood that I'm working on with the hole in it is for stepping the mast into the bottom of the hull. This should hold it firmly and hopefully straight up and down. I found this golf club at Goodwill and decided it would be a better carbon fiber mast than the expensive pieces of carbon fiber I saw on Amazon. Here I soldered on a brass piece with 4 prongs on it for the top of the mast to hold the jib line, which is also like the forestay, and the line going to the top of the main mast and the 2 sides for the 2 shrouds. I stopped by an archery store and asked if they had any carbon fiber arrows. I only wanted to buy just one. When I told them it was for the mast of a sailboat, they gave me one. At some point, you should always paint the inside of the hull. Of course, This is going to seal it and make sure, again, in case you get any water in the boat, that it doesn't cause any damage to the wood. But also, of course, you could paint it any color, but most builders like to choose white. And a lot of real boats are white, and this way you can see anything, any mistakes or anything that gets inside. It's easier to clean it up and know when it's clean. Now I'm adding a thin layer of plywood to the top of the cabin top to make it smoother. If we're ever going to steer this ship, we'll have to build a rudder. Here we're epoxying some plywood together, then putting a layer of fiberglass on each side. Again, this is a multi-step process. Here we're going to put some copper tubes on the back of the boat to be the pivot pin for the rudder. Wanted to make sure they were both lined up with each other. So we use this level for a straight edge. That looks straight to me. Here's the rudder being finished. Here's the pin that's going to hold the rudder into the boat. And there we have a rudder mounted, roughly. Here I'm using some brass strips to make the chain plates and the stem band. Here I'm installing the chain plates. And here I am installing the stem band. These are temporary stainless steel screws. I have to go to the hardware store to get some brass screws first before I complete this installation. First coat of primer. I know it looks terrible, but that's what the spotting putty is for. Little Bondo spotting over and over again. Put it on, sand it off, spray paint again to see how bad it looks, then put it on and sand it off and do it over and over. In theory, with each cycle, there should be less and less of the Bondo spotting putty. After you think you have the primer done pretty well, and all of the imperfections taken out. Then you spray it with a silver paint. Silver will reveal all of the imperfections much more than just plain old primer will. I use a vertical caliper gauge to try and mark the water line. You have to make sure you get whatever measurements you can off the plans at the front or the back of the boat, make sure it's level, and then mark the line. Now we're going to try to put some masking tape along that water line. Now I'll try putting on a second coat of white paint. And a third coat. I had little strips of masking tape over where the chain plates would go, and that would allow me to epoxy the chain plates on when I finally was done with the white paint, and it would adhere to the fiberglass.
This is the world's worst masking tape job.
Now I'm working on the cabin top. This is a lot of fiddly stuff here because there is absolutely no help in the plans on how to do this. This hole is for a switch that can charge the battery and turn the battery on and off without getting inside the cabin. Now I'm drilling holes for some brass rods. They're not just decorative, they're made to hold the cabin down. I probably won't remove the cabin very often, but if I ever have to, I just pull the rods out and lift the cabin off. Here I'm trying to figure out where all of the radial parts go. I have to get a rudder servo in the back, the sail servo in the middle someplace, and the receiver and the battery pack. Now I'm making a sort of a subfloor inside the cabin roof. The purpose of this is so that the strings or ropes that go from the sail servo out to the sail would get tangled up in all of the junk inside the cabin. So I was hoping that with a nice smooth floor that perhaps these lines going to the sail from the winch or from the servo wouldn't get caught on anything. Here you see my sail servo. I mounted it with silicone. I like to use big globs of silicone. It holds it pretty securely. It can vibrate if necessary and won't hurt the servo. And if I have to take it out, I can easily cut the silicone away and pull the servo out. Now I'm working on the cockpit interior. The outsides are where you can run the wires from the servo into the cabin, but the inside here I'm putting what would be the backrest when you're sitting in a cabin if you were sailing a real boat, and of course the floor, and then the front and the back part where the servo is. I'll cover that hole up with a piece of wood here in a minute. The real cockpit, both on the model and on the real boat that this was modeled after, goes much further back, about halfway where that servo is. But I chose to do it this way because I think it looks nice and it's easier to set up the servo. Here I am installing seats in the cockpit with styrofoam underneath them. And then after that, I'm going to start mounting the rudder servo. I have to put some braces up against the back of the cockpit for the servo mounts. Here I am shaping the rear deck and also mounting the rudder servo, again with silicone. I'm custom fitting the top sides of the cockpit here, and I decided to adhere them to the hull with silicone instead of glue this time to seal up the spaces in case I ever had to get at the rudder servo wiring. Here I'm custom cutting some foam pieces to put in the bow of the ship, but I'm trying to leave room to maybe add lead later if I have to balance the boat. I'm also leaving a little hole at the top, sort of where I can build a custom hatch here, and I'll be able to go through the hatch to add or remove weights to balance the boat. Here I am touching up the stained woodwork where I didn't do a good job on the first time, and now I'm applying a white oil-based paint. In most cases it's just to seal the woodwork. In some cases I will leave it white, but it'll take multiple coats later before it becomes reasonably shiny. The front hatch hinge is a piece of cloth. Here is my attempt to make a rub rail out of a dowel. So first I'm sanding it down so that I'm trying to turn it into a half round shape. Here I'm clamping this rub rail to the side of the boat so I can try and draw the lines to where I have to sand through the paint to securely attach the rub rail. Here I'm staining my half-round dowels to become the rub rails. This is the first coat of polyurethane on the rub rails. I'm sanding down through the white paint to get to the fiberglass so I can get a good bond for when I glue the rub rails onto the side of the hull. Here I'm spraying water on the rub rail, trying to warp the wood so that it's roughly in the contour of the ship. I just have a couple little clamps holding it on. Now with a combination of 5-minute 2-part epoxy and slow setting thicker CA, I'm attempting to attach the first rub rail and clamp it to the side of the ship. You can never have too many clamps. And now I'm doing the same thing for the starboard side. Adding the control horn to the rudder. I got some decorative hobby sticks at Walmart that I'm cutting to size to make the bench seats for the cockpit and for the cockpit floor. I'm just cutting them to size here. I'll have to stain and urethane them before I put them in. I had to label all of these floorboards so I know what order they went in. Then I stained them and urethaned them. Here I'm putting the floor in the cockpit, and right after that I'll do the seats of the cockpit. Now in the deck section of the bow, there's a lot of fiddly work to get all of these floorboards or planks to fit with all of the angles in the short stubby pieces. And I had to make one little bitty piece to go right down the middle of everything. We'll get on to staining and urethaning and then remounting them properly. Now I'm working on the travelers. This is the aft traveler for the mainsail. And this is the cover for it. This is the forward traveler for the jib. This is my gooseneck fitting for the main boom. I used polyester thread wrapped around the carbon fiber boom and then CA'd it in place. This brass strip is actually at the bottom of the mast because I have it upside down in the vise. Here I'm trying to put it up for a boom vang connection and also for a little strip to align the mast with the fore and aft axes of the boat. This blade that I soldered onto the end of the boom vang is for alignment of the mast in the hull so that it'll slide into a little slot. And of course I drilled the hole for the actual boom vang here. My original gooseneck didn't work out so good. There was too much slop in the main boom, so I added a brass shim here to tighten it up and then replace the eye hook with a cotter key for the fitting for the main boom. Here I cut a slot in the top of the deck so when I put the mast boom in, it slides down into the slot. Here the boom is just loosely fitted against the gooseneck. It's not epoxied in yet. I put a brass ring around the boom for the boom end of the boom vang. Here's my attempt with a plumber's fairing tool to try and make fair leads to lead the lines going from the servos up to the top deck. I'd been putting off painting of the blue areas of the front hatch and the cockpit roof and the bench seats in the cockpit for quite some time. I finally got around to the blue paint here. I used cotter keys for the boom for the jib and the main boom to connect to the breastplate and the main mast. I was concerned about having them water getting in them, so I tried to pour epoxy down the hole where the front of the jib boom and the main boom went. So here I was rigging up, setting them up so they're vertical so I could pour some epoxy down the hole. As an afterthought, I was concerned about water getting in the bottom of the cockpit and in the front of the ship and not having a place to drain. So here I drilled some holes and ran a brass tube from the cockpit out to the side of the ship, right at the water line where the water line marker is. In the forward part of the deck, I cut a couple of scupper slots, and as you can see, the scupper slot on the starboard side was a much better job than the scupper slot on the port side. So I ended up sticking a toothpick in and filling the excess with epoxy so that it would be roughly the same size and shape as the one on the starboard side. I measured so carefully, and yet when I drilled 2 holes and made it wider, one was above the level of the deck and one wasn't. I'm repainting the upper white part of the hull. Probably won't be the last time. I used poster board to cut out the shape of the sails to use them as templates for cutting the sails. Here I'm using lightweight 2-sided pressure sensitive fusible tape to create the hems for the mainsail and the jib. I cut them out on this mat with an X-Acto knife. I originally set the hems to be 1 inch wide, but I changed it to 1/2 inch, hoping that I'll use 1/4 inch to run the line through for hooking it up to the mast and the booms. After that, I made this little strip of nylon that I put in with double-sided tape again. The hope here is that that's where I'll apply the grommets. Then I took a little piece of scrap nylon that I'm going to use for testing, because I have to iron this tape to activate it to melt the plastic so that it's a permanent fixture. Now I'm installing bolt rope in the hem of each sail. So I have this tarred nylon line that I'm pushing through each hem. I also did it to this test piece, and here I'm sewing it up as a test to see how good the sewing and little CA holds the bolt rope. Now I'm sewing the rest of the sails. Yes, this took several hours. Here's the results of sewing the hems down on each of these sails. More than half of the sewing was actually done in another room and isn't on video. I decided I better machine stitch the hems. Here I'm zooming in on my like new but antique Spartan sewing machine. A Spartan is basically a Singer sewing machine that is made in Ireland, I believe. It's the same as the Featherweight. Little bitty thing, weighs a ton. This morning, my goal was to put the boat together, as most of the pieces are available now, though there is some work left to do. My hope was that I could actually put it in the bathtub and check to see how much ballast I'd need to bring it to the waterline. Unfortunately, it seemed everything I touch I broke, and so now I'm back to repairing the deck latches and the fasteners and pins that were holding the top cabin in. One of those days where you wished you hadn't got out of bed. So here's where I'm trying to catch up from my mistakes from yesterday. I broke the pieces when I tried to put the brass bars in that hold the cabin roof on. So now I've redone the cabin roof parts and drilled some new holes in them and I'm inserting the brass bars. Now I'm finally putting the mast and the sails on, well, just temporarily with some white line, just so I can have them all there to mostly check the weight. Hopefully soon I'm headed to put it in the bathtub to find out where it floats on the water line. Don't worry too much about the jib. The top of the jib will be pulled back to the mast after I get the grommets and the stays in the front of the main mast. The piece of aluminum laying across the top of the boat is actually the keel, and to that I'm supposed to fasten 1.5 pounds of ballast. It turns out it takes 2 pounds of ballast to bring it down to its water line, much of it in the front of the ship, so that'll need some work. To measure the amount I had to bring it down to the water line, I placed objects on top of the boat, in this case a 1, 2, 3 block and a couple of bottles of water. Then I measured them carefully with this old 3-bar balance scale, and it came out to 914 grams or 28 ounces or 2 pounds. At first it might look like 414.2 grams, but in reality there's a 500 gram counterbalance at the front of this balance. Here are the pelican hooks that I created. I only need 2 or maybe 3, but I have other projects in mind for the future. Here is the starboard side standing rigging secured with this pelican hook. You flip over the pelican hook and slide the aluminum tube down to fasten it. To size the standing rigging at the top of the mast, I wrapped it around with nylon thread and then dabbed a little CA on it to harden it and make it permanent. Repainting the hull for the second time. I was really reluctant to put grommets in the sail. I know that on my previous build of a ship, the bolt rope held the front of the sail just fine, but nevertheless, I relented and finally put in the grommets. I had the same reservations about putting peril beads on the mast. I ended up getting some at Walmart and at a hobby store, and I assumed were going to be the right size, but I didn't know for sure until I tried it. I made 2 test pieces, one with interleaved large beads and smaller beads, and one with just smaller beads, just to see which would fit the best. I ended up choosing the set with the smaller beads and used this test strip to determine how many beads I needed on the widest part of the mast. These are the beads I ended up using. I made portholes with some black felt tip marker and brass grommets. After procrastinating, I finally got around to making the control arm for the servo for the mainsail and the jib. I went down to our local used tire store and asked if they had any surplus wheel weights, lead wheel weights that they didn't want, and they had several. Unfortunately, new wheel weights aren't lead, so most of this was junk, and I ended up getting 1 pound of lead out of this mess. I made a mold out of a piece of dowel and some modeling clay, and then I cast it in plaster Paris. Took me several tries and breaking a few. Then I filled each half of the plaster Paris with water and weighed it, and then I measured the water weight afterwards to make sure I was near 80 grams, which is 2 pounds. Then I sanded the flat part of both halves of the mold so that they could line up and match, and then I made a wooden frame around it and siliconed all of those parts together so that I could pour some lead in there. These holes I drilled in the bottom of the keel are to retain the lead ballast weight or bulb. Here's my form ready for casting. I tried as best I could to make it level, straight up and down and fore and aft. I'm adding 1 pound of lead sinkers and my 1 pound lead ingot I made into the pot, melting it up, ready to pour it into the mold. All right, here goes nothing. I tried to melt the top down better. I don't know if it helped or not. The resultant casting setting in the mold on the floor, I'm giving it 24 hours to cool down. Meanwhile, back at the sailboat, I trimmed off the ropes and lines for the sails and set the adjustments for the servo length to let the sails in and out. For those who are keeping score, yes, after all of that careful labeling, I put the keel on bulb on the keel plane backwards. This will take another drilling or elongating of that hole before it fits properly in the hull. It looks a little crude, I know, but nothing that a little Bondo won't fix. I elongated the hole on the keel so that I could put it in either forwards or backwards. I used the air-powered die filer to do this. I sprayed primer on the lead weight and then I sprayed silver paint on top of that so it would look sort of natural with the aluminum keel plate. Then from the plans of the full-scale wild duck, I made a stencil so that I could put the duck symbol on the sail. I just used a black felt tip marker and I thought I got decent results. This is my attempt to build a boom bang. I thought it turned out okay. First trip in the car to the lake. I expect the nose to be a little high, so I should have to add some lead to the front. I hope it floats okay, and I hope it sails okay. I still need to attach the top of the jib to the main mast and pull it back in, and of course add the ship's name Daisy to the side of the boat, but all in all, I think it went pretty well for the first sail. After sailing for the first time, I finally tracked down some lettering to put the name Daisy on her. Her first photo opportunity. She's sitting on a stand that's made for the laser sailboat. We're going to call her done for now. This is her permanent mooring place on the workbench beside the belt sander. Hi guys, as always, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. There's 3 ways you can help. Tell your friends about it, click on the subscribe icon below, and click on the thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. Bye. Here's a shameless plug for my book. It's called One Town Kid. It's available on Amazon and all the ebook places. Thank you. Bye.